Shalem and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The horrific Bondi Beach massacre is just the latest and most lethal expression of worldwide anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli sentiments inspired by Islamic terrorism and characterized by well-coordinated and directed attacks. How does Israel, Western intelligence, law enforcement agencies, and host governments cope with this rising tide of threats? Joining us to analyze these matters include retired Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, formerly a Deputy National Security Advisor of the State of Israel. It's good to see you, Eran.
Good to be back, even if in dark circumstances.
Alas, indeed. Also joining us is Mr. Oded Ailam, formerly the Director of the Mossad Counter-Terrorism Division, among a long list of others, currently a Senior Fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. It's great to see you, Oded.
Thanks for having me.
With us in the studio is our TV7 Editor-at-Large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, a bleak 72 hours, 48 hours, seeing over 16 murdered and some 40 wounded is horrendous, to say the least. Give us a broader understanding of the complexity of dealing with such a situation in which a father and son from Pakistani origin come to a moment where they, out of religious clarity, as they put it, take it upon themselves to engage in mass murder.
So, of course, there is nothing new in anti-Semitism per se. It has always been a broad and quite deep sentiment, both in Christian, Muslim, and other countries, and perhaps cultures or subcultures. And Israel had to fight Palestinian terrorism and other forms of terrorism throughout the world. But apparently there has never been such a mix of both social media and technology, which manages to bring the religious fervor and inspiration to communities the world over, images over television and the internet, TikTok and all the rest of Israel's self-defense actions in Gaza and elsewhere, the availability of firearms, even in democracies. We heard that one of the perpetrators in Sydney had licenses for 6 firearms, a one-man arsenal. And all of that, given the laxity of the protection services, one can hardly blame them. There are so many targets everywhere. The events held by the communities or sometimes by the Israeli embassy, as was the case in Washington a few months ago, an event held by the embassy for young people in the area. All of that makes it extremely difficult to anticipate and then try to avert, to forestall all of the attacks. And maybe 95% of the time you get intelligence if the perpetrators show any indication. Of course, they can be law-abiding until the very day they decide to do it. It's very hard to anticipate that. All of that means that the communities must do better in organizing themselves for self-defense, report any suspicious activity, and know that it is dangerous all over, in Israel too.
It's dangerous all over. With that being said, Mr. Ailam, I'd like to turn to you and ask, since as Mr. Oren mentioned, Sajid Akram, 50 years old, held a license for 6 firearms, and his son, Navid, was investigated under suspicion, not only suspicion, but concrete data that he pledged allegiance 6 years ago to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and was affiliated to the Islamic State, specifically an Islamic State in Australia, a cell there. And the ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, which investigated him, did have him on file before the attack took place. And yet, they did not keep the eyes on him at all times. And we see the result of such an individual taking, of course, to the most extreme forms of religious practice by taking the lives of so many individuals for the mere reason that they are Jews, that they may be Israelis amongst them. And naturally, this is not only an attack against Israel and Jews, but against Western civilization at large.
The problem lies even deeper in the Western society that hadn't yet managed to understand the threat that the fundamentalist Islam is threatening the core of the Western society. They appreciate their values, the moderate values, liberal, and so on, and they simply do not grasp what is the meaning of jihad, of Muslim Brotherhood, and so on. So especially we can see it in Australia. I just want to throw in a few facts regarding Australia. Since the October 7, Australia, we had seen the worst and the biggest demonstration, anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic in the world. Most of them were carrying banners with Nasrallah and Muhammad Def and so on, and shouting slogans from of death to the IDF and so on. And there was no real approach or any sort of, I would say, even resentment between in the Australian society, and especially the law enforcement regarding that. And this is exactly is where you nurture such ideas and ideology and so on. I would just say one word regarding the event itself. I simply cannot understand how could it be so poorly protected by the local. It's an event that takes place about 40 years, the same place, Bondi Beach. I've been there, I know the place. We haven't seen for 8 minutes even one law enforcement police officer or even security guard. The person who actually took over the terrorists was a civilian. And this is a really major setback for the Australian security forces. And I think it's the outcome of the policy that do not grasp the imminent threat to the Australian society. Let's not forget there are 3.5% Muslims in Australia. In Sydney itself, there are around 360,000 Muslims. Most of them, by the way, come from Lebanon and Turkey. And there are about 60 mosques in Sydney, where every Friday you can hear the preacher is preaching the fundamental of the jihad in the mosque. And I think it was managed very poorly by the Australian law enforcement.
That is something that really baffles me because Australian intelligence is known for being very potent, uh, particularly also when we're talking about technological capabilities and their capacity to penetrate far beyond enemy lines and extract very valuable information. And yet, when I speak with intelligence officers that engage with their Australian counterparts, including people from the intelligence agencies in Australia, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for several years now, uh, their capacity to fully comprehend the dangers of jihad, as you mentioned, Mr. Ailam, are close to zero. It really baffles me. And on that, Dr. Lerman, you also were a senior intelligence officer for many years in the IDF Intelligence Directorate, and I wonder what needs to be done in order to relay the understanding of this imminent threat. It's not something that is going to happen in the distant future. We're talking here about attacks against, the attack now in Sydney, but what about Manchester? What about the attacks that happened in Washington or in Berlin?
Yeah, Europe has seen quite a lot. I have to say that some of the European internal intelligence services have made significant adjustments and have been actually quite actively monitoring, for example, as Mr. Ailam mentioned, the mosques, the radical preachers, deporting subversive elements, keeping a close eye on the climate of sedition in these groups and this inbred culture that has been tolerated for too long. But the underlying problem, I think, actually there are two underlying problems. One is that somehow the kind of language and action that is tolerated when it comes from Muslims would not have been tolerated if it came from the extreme right or the extreme left in the Western society. And it is a sort of, I would call it racism of reduced expectations. It's a racism in reverse that somehow accepts that this is a normative behavior in a multicultural setting when it really is not and should not be accepted as such. And it is an insult to Muslims that it is tolerated by Western societies as something that is normative for Muslims when it is not normative for anyone else. And the second problem, and it is, I think, goes a long way towards explaining what happened to the ASIO and the Australians, is the reluctance to breach privacy and to actually act on the basis of information that can easily be obtained, not necessarily with a court order, on the social networks, because we are dealing here not with the traditional intelligence work against large organizations. In fact, I think perhaps people here in Israel were too quick to point the blame at Iran. Iran did encourage and push previous attacks on Israel, on Jewish, even a market, a supermarket in the Bondi Beach area. I mean, it's not for nothing that the blame was that a finger was pointed at Iran, but in this case, it looks more like a Daesh influence or Daesh inspiration. Of course, Daesh and Iran don't sit together in the same room. They've been slaughtering each other in the previous decade, and that's not necessarily the case here. That this was a well-organized operation. It looks more like an individual initiative. However, these are not individual initiatives in the void. They normally leave a trail of evidence in the social networks, if only because the people who perpetrate them assume that they may be promoted to the rank of Shaheed and they want the world to know, or the people who they care for to know what they did and why they did it and what they are about to do. And in Israel, we've been able to foil, I think, hundreds and maybe thousands of such pre-planned individual attacks. And this was pre-planned. I mean, this is not a spur of the moment ramming by a truck.
Clearly.
They brought their guns to and piles of ammunition. And when this happens, there are very often ways of knowing. And the fact that the son in this case was actually noticed by ASIO before tells me that they did not take the necessary measures to make sure that he understands that he is under surveillance effectively. You know, I have friends in a small country not far from Australia, where they have a significant Muslim population, larger than 3.5%. But they never had any trouble, because the moment they notice any untoward action in the social media, somebody gets an invitation to have coffee with the security forces and is put on notice. And there are ways of doing this. They're not necessarily going to be liked by liberal-minded people. But at the end of the day, 15 dead, a girl of 10, and a Holocaust survivor lying on Bondi Beach, dead on Bondi Beach, I think are worse than any infringement of privacy on the social networks.
And the fact of the matter is that Bondi Beach has been subject to repeated attacks, including one just last year where 6 people were murdered in a stabbing attack, really a murderous spree that raises questions with regard to also what Mr. Ailam said about the fact that there's not enough law enforcement on the streets, be they overt or covert, in order to deal with those type of situations immediately at the get-go. And that is something that is devastating. Now, Mr. Oren, you mentioned something earlier, and you pointed to the fact that the senior, the 50-year-old terrorist, was in possession of licenses to 6 firearms, some of which were utilized to this heinous deed that they undertook. And when the chief of police was asked about this matter, he said, well, look, this is part of the Constitution. He had a right of having those weapons, irrespective of the fact that his son was investigated by the intelligence agency for ties to the Islamic State. Now, take that into account. What I ask myself is, are the legal frameworks that provide law enforcement and intelligence agencies the right backing in order to confront those threats and challenges truly tightened to the point which would then allow the organizations to provide the proper security to the individual civilian?
Well, in the case you mentioned, there was hardly any possibility for any agency to claim that because a son is being under investigation, any of his relatives, his father or anyone else, a brother or a cousin, should also be investigated. That's guilt by association. It's not their MO. They're not working.
When it comes to terrorism, there is guilt by association. And that has been proven more than once and has been utilized by every intelligence agency out there.
Granted, but where does it stop? Brothers, cousins, or brothers-in-law. But there is a triple basic organizational flaw, which in many cases can be analyzed. 1, external intelligence versus internal one. MI6, MI5, CIA, FBI, Mossad, Shabak. Second, intelligence vis-a-vis law enforcement. MI5, Metropolitan Police. In the Rabin assassination, the Israeli Shabak versus the Tel Aviv District Police. This was the problem. And the third one in countries with a federal constitution, such as Australia. The New South Wales police had a lot of authority there. In Germany, in the Munich massacre, Bavaria had authority which the federal government relinquished. And in the States too, you have so many massacres where you have federal, state, county, city. So it falls between the cracks.
It does fall between the cracks, but yet I do think that there is a necessity to step up. In Europe, they have actually started to work on this following the various attacks, from the Bataclan attacks to the Charlie Hebdo and other aspects that have created an urgency, at least, and they have allocated many funds for this. But it seems like they're not working fast enough because those attacks are recurring time after time after time. Mr. Ailam, we have roughly 5.5 minutes left, and I'd like to give you and Dr. Lerman the opportunity to give us a practical analysis. What should be done by those governments and by the various practitioners and officers and others listening to us right now in order to bring about the necessary change to combat those threats and deal with them? I know there's no hermetic security, but nonetheless, there is a necessity to deal with this once and for all.
First of all, I think Germany is the leading country right now in Europe regarding changing the law and changing the overall approach towards fundamentalist Islam. And I think most of the countries should follow the German example. But I would say in a very short way. First of all, change the philosophy, change the concept, understand the nature of this fundamental event that we are seeing, and understand that, you know, it's like Giuliani in New York. It starts with a graffiti and it ends with a murder. It starts with a demonstration that you allow those people to facilitate hatred and deaths and so on, and it nurture those people that wants to be shaheed. And first of all, it's a overall understanding that you have to change your attitude, your concept, and of course, following it is changing the law and allowing law enforcement more tools in order to confront this phenomena.
So I will challenge you on this one and ask a question that if you could answer it briefly, because there is a fine line between freedom of speech and incitement to violence. We all understand that. And some may say that limiting or finding the right balance there may bring about the slippery slope into the manner in which totalitarian regimes enforce, so to speak, freedom of speech. What can be done in order to facilitate the necessary discernment in order to frustrate, on the one hand, the incitement aspect, while at the same time also protecting the importance of freedom of speech?
I would just answer it very, very shortly. It's walking a tightrope. And of course, you need all the time, you're walking on thin ice in order not to breach a certain point where you become a totalitarian state. And I think right now, the urgent need of the Western society is to protect itself, and the measures that are being taken are not enough, and it should be changed.
That is clear, undoubtedly. Dr. Lerman?
Well, you're right. It is a very tight challenge to distinguish between legitimate protest and incitement. But at the end of the day, certain things are quite evident. When the language is globalized, the intifada, which we've heard all the way from Sydney to the streets of New York. there needs to be a very clear line drawn. The Intifada was not peaceful protest, not in the way, in the nature it took. Certainly not the so-called second Intifada from 2000 onwards. And that implies legitimizing violence. And that has to end. And people should, who have been in positions of tolerance towards this kind of language should be put on the spot, whether we are talking about Prime Minister Albanese or Mayor-elect Mamdani. That language is intolerable, and it needs to be, let's say, a basis for law enforcement action. And with all due respect to, and here I totally agree with what has been said here about Germany, with all due respect to the comments made in America about the German attitude towards freedom of speech. The German attitude is based on the experience of what may happen to a democracy if it does not defend itself against violent incitement. And I think it is a quite legitimate way of taking action when the danger is manifest.
And there is also a big difference between what we see in Germany versus what we see in Great Britain, where unfortunately they have taken it to the extreme. That is, at least from what we see on the sidelines, looking inwards. But Australia is a whole different story. I mean, the words coming out of there is "gas the Jews." It is "death to Israel." It goes beyond what freedom of speech can even be on the sidelines, so to speak, or in that fine line with incitement. This is blatant incitement, and doing so while feeling secure enough to continue to do so without any response from the authorities, which is truly, truly alarming. But unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to genuinely thank Mr. Ailam and Dr. Lerman, as well as Mr. Amir Oren, and to thank you at home. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.